The heart monitor was the only sound I remember from that first night. Not my son's voice, not the nurses moving in and out, just that steady, mechanical beeping that told me he was still there, still in there somewhere, while the rest of the world kept spinning without him. I drove 6 hours from Raleigh to Baltimore the moment my daughter-in-law called me. She said there'd been an accident. She said it calmly, the way you tell someone their package was delayed. No tears, no panic. Just, Gilbert had an accident. He's at Johns Hopkins. You should probably come. Probably. That word sat in my chest the whole drive up. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government before I retired, the kind of job where you learn to notice what people try to hide inside numbers, discrepancies, patterns, the small things that don't add up. You get so used to looking for the gap between what something says it is and what it actually is that it becomes second nature. Like breathing, I didn't know I was going to need every bit of that training in the weeks ahead. My son Gilbert is 36. He's a structural engineer. Brilliant, careful, methodical. He married Vanessa 9 years ago, and I'll be honest, I was happy for him. She was charming. She laughed easily. She made my son laugh, and that was enough for me. They had a daughter together, my granddaughter Lily, who is 7 years old and has her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness. I got to Johns Hopkins at 11:40 at night. Vanessa was not there. The nurse at the ICU desk told me visiting hours were over, but I wasn't leaving. I sat in that waiting room with bad coffee and fluorescent lights until 6 in the morning, when a doctor finally came out and explained what had happened. Gilbert's car had gone off Route 29 on a curve he'd driven 100 times. The front brakes had failed. He'd hit the guardrail at speed and rolled twice. He was in a medically induced coma with a fractured vertebrae, a collapsed lung, and bleeding on the brain that they were monitoring. She used the word serious 4 times in that conversation. I asked her where my daughter-in-law was. The doctor said she'd left around midnight, said she needed to get home for the child. Lily was with Vanessa's mother. I knew that because I'd called her from the car. I didn't say anything to the doctor. I just nodded and asked what I could do. Vanessa showed up the next morning at 10, dressed like she was going to brunch. Light blouse, nice earrings. She hugged me and cried, or something that looked like crying, and asked the nurses the same questions I'd asked 8 hours earlier. I watched her. 31 years of looking for things that don't add up. I watched her the way I used to watch spreadsheets. The tears stopped the moment the doctor left the room. I told myself I was being unfair. Grief looks different on different people. Some people go numb. Some people look normal from the outside and are falling apart on the inside. I told myself this and I almost believed it. Then, on the 3rd day, I asked to see Gilbert's phone. The nurses had his personal effects in a sealed bag. Vanessa said she'd already taken the phone home to charge it. I said that was thoughtful. She said, of course, she wanted to make sure nothing happened to it. I drove to their house that evening to see Lily. My granddaughter ran to me at the door and held on so tightly I had to blink hard to keep it together. 7 years old, and she already understood that something was badly wrong, even if no one had told her exactly what. Kids always know more than we think. Vanessa was on a phone call in the kitchen. I could hear pieces of it. Not enough to understand, just enough to notice that her voice was low and unhurried, nothing like someone keeping a vigil. I asked Lily if she wanted to watch a movie, and she said yes, and we sat on the couch, and I thought about that tone of voice. On day 5, one of the ICU nurses pulled me aside. Her name was Deborah, and she'd been working that unit for 19 years. She had the kind of face that had seen everything and stopped being surprised by most of it, but she looked at me differently, carefully, the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide whether to say something. She asked me how well I knew my daughter-in-law. I said I knew her well enough. She paused. Then she said, I'm not supposed to share patient information, but your son is the patient, and you're his father, and sometimes things bother me enough that I can't stay quiet. She told me that on the 2nd night, the night Vanessa had left early, she'd overheard Vanessa on the phone in the hallway outside the ICU. Not the words, she said, just the tone, light, almost relieved, and that in her 19 years She'd developed a sense for things that didn't match, and she wanted me to pay attention. I thanked her. I didn't sleep that night. On day 7, I asked Gilbert's bank directly, not Vanessa, the bank, about adding myself as an authorized contact for emergency notifications on my son's account. I was his father. He was incapacitated, and I explained that I was concerned about his affairs while he was hospitalized. The branch manager, a young man named Spencer, looked at his screen for a moment and then looked at me and then looked at his screen again. He said he couldn't share account details without proper authorization. I said I understood. He said very quietly, "Sir, I'd suggest speaking with an attorney as soon as possible." That's not what you say to a man asking a routine question. I had an attorney by that afternoon. His name is Everett. We went to UNC together 40 years ago, and he's been doing estate and family law in North Carolina ever since. I drove back to Raleigh that evening, sat in his office, and laid out everything I knew and everything I suspected. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about him. When I finished, Everett leaned back and said, "If she has durable power of attorney, and he's incapacitated, she has broad authority. The question is what she's doing with it." Gilbert had given Vanessa durable POA 3 years ago when he was traveling abroad for a long-term project. Standard procedure. Sensible, even. Neither of them had updated it after things between them, and I was only learning this now, had started to deteriorate. Because here is what I didn't know until I started asking the right questions. My son had been quietly preparing to file for divorce. He had spoken to an attorney of his own 2 months before the accident. He had documented finances. He had moved carefully because Vanessa had a temper, and he was thinking about Lily's stability. He'd told his friend Lawrence about it. Not me. He didn't want me to worry. Lawrence called me because he'd heard about the accident, and he thought I should know the full picture. He drove to Raleigh and sat in my kitchen and told me everything my son had shared with him over the last 6 months. The arguments, the spending. Vanessa had been pulling from their joint account steadily, amounts below the threshold that triggers automatic alerts. The credit card in Gilbert's name she'd opened without his knowledge. The fact that Gilbert had noticed the numbers shifting and had flagged it, and Vanessa had cried and promised it would stop, and it hadn't. Lawrence said Gilbert had felt trapped. He loved his daughter. He was trying to do things right. I sat with that for a long time, then I got to work. 31 years of forensic accounting doesn't disappear when you retire. I still had colleagues. I still understood how to read a financial picture, the way a doctor reads an X-ray. With Everett's guidance on what was and wasn't legal, I started building a timeline. The credit card opened in Gilbert's name 13 months ago. Balance $41,000. Joint savings account, the one they'd been building since Lily was born, drawn down from $82,000 to just under $9,000 over 14 months. Investment account linked to Gilbert's 401k. I couldn't access it directly, but Everett filed an emergency motion in Maryland Family Court to freeze marital assets pending the incapacity proceeding. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Frances Okafor, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, granted a temporary freeze within 18 hours. Vanessa called me that evening. She was not using her brunch voice anymore. She said I had no right to interfere in her marriage. She said I was a controlling old man who'd never respected her. She said Gilbert would be furious when he woke up. She said a lot of things, and I let her say all of them. And then I said, "Vanessa, I hope my son wakes up so he can make his own decisions. In the meantime, I'm going to make sure there's something left for him when he does." She hung up. I called Lily that night. She asked me when Daddy was going to wake up. I said I didn't know, but that I was working on it. She asked what I meant by that, and I said I meant that I was watching over him. She said okay, and asked if I could bring her a coloring book next time I visited. I said absolutely. I had to put the phone down for a minute after I hung up. The accident investigation had been filed as a single vehicle incident. No other cars, no witnesses who'd stopped. Standard report. But Lawrence had mentioned something that had been nagging at me, Gilbert had told him, just 2 weeks before the accident, that his car had felt off. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly soft on the brake pedal. He'd meant to take it in. I'm not a mechanic. I'm very clear about what I am and am not, but I know how to ask questions, and I know who to ask. I called an old colleague from my government days, a man named Alistair who spent 25 years investigating insurance fraud and has looked at more staged vehicle incidents than he can count. I told him the situation. He asked me where the car was. I found out it had been towed to an impound lot in Howard County, Maryland, pending the insurance claim. Alistair drove to that impound lot. He knew people. He got a look at the car. He called me 2 days later, and his voice was quiet and deliberate, in a way I recognized. It's the voice you use when you have something important to say, and you want to make sure the other person actually hears it. He said, "The brake line on the driver's side front wheel. It wasn't failed. It was compromised. There's a wear pattern there that isn't consistent with road damage or normal deterioration. Someone knew what they were doing, but they weren't quite careful enough." I sat with that for a very long time. I want to be precise about what I knew at that moment and what I didn't. I knew the brakes had been interfered with. I didn't know who. I didn't know when. I am a forensic accountant, not a detective, and I was very aware that what I suspected and what I could prove were two different things. What I did was call Everett, and then Everett called the right people. The Maryland State Police Collision Reconstruction Unit re-examined the vehicle within 4 days. Their determination aligned with what Alistair had found. At that point, it was no longer a civil matter. A criminal investigation opened quietly, and I was told by the detective in charge, a careful, methodical man named Sergeant Trevino, to let them do their work and to say nothing publicly. I kept going to the hospital. I sat with Gilbert. I talked to him. I know they say patients in comas can sometimes hear, and whether that's true or not, I needed to talk to him. I told him about the weather, about Lily, about a fishing trip we'd taken when he was 12 to a lake in the Smoky Mountains where we caught nothing and laughed about it for years. I didn't tell him what was happening. I just told him to hold on. On the 19th day, Gilbert's eyes opened. I was there. I was sitting in the chair I'd basically claimed as mine, and I was reading, or pretending to read, and I looked up and his eyes were open and looking at the ceiling. I pressed the call button and stood up and said his name, and he turned his head slowly toward me, and his face shifted in a way I can only describe as relief. He couldn't speak yet. The tube had just come out that morning, but he looked at me and I said, "You're okay. I'm here. Lily is okay." And something in his whole body seemed to let go. It took him 5 more days to speak clearly. The first full sentence he said to me was, "Did you know she was going to file for divorce first? She told me she was going to make sure I got nothing." He had not been told yet about the investigation. He had not been told about the brake line. He had not been told about the frozen accounts. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wasn't imagining it." I said, "No, son, you were not." Vanessa had retained an attorney the day after the asset freeze, a move that told us she'd understood immediately what was happening. But the criminal investigation had changed the landscape entirely. When Sergeant Trevino's unit connected the timeline, Vanessa's access to the vehicle 2 days before the accident, the specific nature of the brake compromise, cell records placing her at a repair shop she'd paid cash at. The picture that emerged was not one that any civil attorney was going to be able to manage away. She was arrested on a Thursday morning, 41 days after my son's accident. I didn't watch the news that night. I took Lily to dinner at a diner she loves in Raleigh, the kind of place with paper placemats and crayons in a cup on the table, and she colored a picture of a horse while I ate a club sandwich and thought about all the ways life can go sideways and all the ways it can, sometimes, come back around. Lily asked me if Mummy was going to be in trouble. I said, "Some things happen that weren't right, and sometimes when that happens there are consequences, but you didn't do anything wrong, and your dad loves you, and I love you, and none of that changes." She thought about it for a moment, and then she went back to coloring her horse. The divorce was filed by Gilbert's attorney once he was well enough to participate. Given the criminal proceedings, the asset division was handled under a different kind of scrutiny than a typical case. The marital estate, what remained of it after Vanessa's years of systematic withdrawal, was accounted for fully. The court ordered restitution. The credit card debt she'd accumulated in his name was assigned to her. Vanessa pled guilty to charges of criminal fraud and a reduced charge related to the vehicle. Her attorney negotiated. She received a sentence of 4 years with eligibility for parole. I am not going to pretend that felt like enough. But it is what the system produced, and I have spent enough years working within systems to know that wanting more justice than the system can give you is a road with no end. Gilbert spent 8 weeks in patient rehabilitation. He walks with a slight hitch in his left side that the doctors say may fade over time. He's back in Raleigh now, living 20 minutes from me. He went back to work part-time in January, which I advised against, and he did it anyway, which is exactly the kind of man he is. Lily is in 2nd grade. She's doing well. She sees a counselor every 2 weeks, someone who specializes in children who've been through family disruption. And from what Gilbert tells me, she's processing things with a clarity that honestly puts adults to shame. She slept over at my house last Saturday. We made pancakes. She told me very seriously that she thinks I put too much butter in the pan. She's probably right. There is something I want to say, and I've been thinking about how to say it since this all ended. I'm not a hero of this story. I want to be very clear about that. I'm a father who happened to have a specific set of skills that were useful at a specific moment. Most parents in my position don't have 31 years of forensic accounting. Most people don't have a friend like Alastair or a lawyer like Everett. Most people going through what Gilbert went through don't have someone who knows how to read a financial pattern like a sentence. That's not virtue. That's luck. The specific, accidental luck of a career path taken long ago. I think about Deborah, the ICU nurse, a lot. She risked something real by saying what she said to me. She didn't have to. She could have told herself it wasn't her place, it wasn't her business. She couldn't be sure. But she'd been watching for 19 years, and something didn't sit right, and she said so. That took more courage than anything I did. I did paperwork and made phone calls. She put her professional reputation on the line for a stranger. I sent her a handwritten note after everything was resolved. She wrote back 2 lines on a note card and said she was glad my son was going to be okay. I kept the note card. Gilbert asked me once, about a month into his recovery, whether I'd had any moment of doubt, whether I'd ever thought maybe I was wrong, maybe I was a suspicious old man seeing patterns that weren't there. I told him the truth, yes. Every single day, the gap between suspicion and certainty is enormous, and you have to be very careful in that space. You can destroy people with suspicion. You can burn relationships and reputations on things that turn out to be nothing. I had 31 years of practice sitting in that space, looking at something that might be fraud, might be nothing, might be an error, and making careful, methodical moves while waiting for the picture to clarify. The picture clarified, but I want to be honest, it might not have. It might have clarified the other way. And if it had, I'd have owed Vanessa an apology and probably burned every bridge between us permanently. That's the thing about doing the right thing carefully. You don't always get to know in advance that it's going to work out. You just do what the evidence tells you. You move slowly. You ask the people who know more than you do. You try not to let what you want to be true contaminate what you're actually seeing. Gilbert is going to be okay. Lily is going to be okay. That's enough. That's more than enough. I was back in Raleigh on a regular Tuesday when my phone buzzed, and it was Lily calling from Gilbert's cell. She does this sometimes, just calls to tell me something, and she said, "Grandpa, I learned a new word today. Resilient. Do you know what it means?" I said I did. She said, "My teacher says it means you bend, but you don't break." I said, "That sounds about right." She said, "I think we're resilient, Grandpa." I had to pull my car over. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said. "I think we are." I've been thinking lately about what actually holds a life together when everything starts to come apart at once. It's not strength exactly. I used to think it was. 31 years of federal work. You start to believe that competence is the thing, that if you're thorough enough, careful enough, you can control outcomes. Then your son ends up in a hospital bed, and you realize control was always a story you were telling yourself. What actually holds things together, I think, is paying attention. And being willing to act on what you see, even when it's uncomfortable. even when it means being the person no one in the room wants to be. Vanessa made choices. She made them over months, maybe years, each one small enough to feel manageable, each one building on the last. That's how it usually works. Not one dramatic decision, but 100 quiet ones, each pulling you a little further from the person you started out being. By the time the break line was touched, she had already crossed so many lines that I suspect she'd stopped seeing them. That's what happens when we let small compromises accumulate without accounting for them. The weight of it eventually becomes something you can't carry honestly anymore. And Deborah, the nurse who stopped me in the hallway, made a different kind of choice. She had every reason to stay quiet. 19 years of professional caution, institutional liability, the simple human preference to not get involved in other people's disasters. But something in her understood that silence is also a choice, and that choosing silence when you know something matters is its own kind of action. She paid attention. She spoke. I don't think Gilbert would be coaching his daughter's soccer team this fall if Deborah had decided it wasn't her place. That's what I want Lily to grow up understanding. Not that the world is fair, it isn't, and pretending otherwise doesn't prepare anyone for anything. But that the choices we make, especially the quiet ones that nobody's watching, have weight. They move things. The decision to be honest when lying is easier. The decision to speak when staying silent is safer. The decision to keep going when stopping feels entirely reasonable. Those choices compound, just like the other kind. Gilbert asked me once if I ever doubted myself through all of this. I told him the truth constantly. Doubt isn't weakness. Doubt is what keeps you honest. It's the thing that makes you check your work, question your assumptions, make sure what you're seeing is real, and not just what you want to see. The people who scare me aren't the ones who doubt themselves. It's the ones who are absolutely certain. I'm 63 years old and I'm still learning. I'm learning from my son, who held on to his integrity even when it would have been much easier not to. I'm learning from Lily, who at 7 years old looked at a world that had just shaken itself apart and decided she was resilient. She's right, we are. And that didn't come from luck. It came from the accumulation of small, honest choices made by ordinary people in hard moments. That's the only foundation I know that actually holds.